August 13th, 1704. The sun hasn't yet broken the horizon over the German plains near a small village called Blenheim, but 36,000 men are already awake, checking their muskets, tightening their boots, knowing that before the day ended, thousands of them would be dead. What none of them knew was that they were about to witness something extraordinary, a battle so perfectly executed, so tactically brilliant, that military historians would study it for centuries. Yet ask most people today about Blenheim, and you'll get blank stares. This is the story of how one man's audacious gamble changed the course of European history and saved Britain from French domination. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to go back 4 years to when everything started to fall apart. The year 1700 should have been peaceful. The great wars of Louis XIV's reign seemed to be winding down. Europe was exhausted from decades of conflict. But then King Charles II of Spain lay dying in his palace in Madrid, and with his death would come a crisis that would plunge the continent into war once again. Charles II was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and he had no children, no brothers, no direct heirs at all. This might seem like just another royal succession crisis, the kind of thing that happened fairly regularly in European history. But this was different. This was catastrophic. Spain in 1700 wasn't just Spain. It was a vast global empire that still stretched around the world. The Spanish controlled the Netherlands, much of Italy, territories in North Africa, the Philippines, and enormous swaths of Central and South America. Spanish treasure fleets carried silver and gold from the Americas back to Europe. Spanish trade routes connected 4 continents. Whoever inherited Spain wouldn't just get a crown, they'd get an empire. There were 2 main candidates for the Spanish throne. First, there was Philippe, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was already the most powerful monarch in Europe. He'd spent his entire reign expanding French power and territory. He commanded the largest army in Europe. His court at Versailles set the standards for fashion, art, and culture across the continent. France under Louis was the dominant power, and everyone knew it. The second candidate was Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. The Habsburgs had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries before Charles II. They saw the Spanish throne as rightfully theirs. Leopold desperately wanted his son to inherit Spain, both for dynastic prestige and because having a Habsburg on the Spanish throne would enormously strengthen the Austrian Empire. European powers had tried to solve this problem diplomatically. There had been partition treaties, complex agreements about dividing the Spanish inheritance to maintain the balance of power. But Charles II, in his final days, made a decision that destroyed all those careful plans. In November 1700, just weeks before his death, he signed a will leaving the entire Spanish inheritance, undivided, to Philippe of France. When Charles died on November 1st, 1700, Philippe became King Philip V of Spain. Louis XIV was ecstatic. He had just doubled his family's power. He reportedly told the Spanish ambassador the Pyrenees no longer exist, suggesting that France and Spain would now act as one. Think about what this meant. France already had the largest population of any European nation, around 20 million people. Spain had another 8 million, plus millions more in its colonies. France already had the strongest army in Europe. Spain had significant military resources and vast wealth flowing from the Americas. If Louis XIV could effectively control both France and Spain, if he could merge their resources and coordinate their foreign policy, he would create a superpower that could dominate the entire continent. England saw this as an existential threat. If France controlled Spain, they'd control both sides of the English Channel. They'd dominate Atlantic trade. They'd have the power to invade England with overwhelming force. The Dutch Republic saw the Spanish Netherlands on their southern border falling under French control, which would put French armies right on their doorstep. Austria saw its historic rival gaining enormous strength. In 1701, England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several other states formed the Grand Alliance. They declared war on France and Spain, fighting to prevent the union of the two crowns. The goal was to put a Habsburg back on the Spanish throne and restore the balance of power. This became the War of the Spanish Succession, and it would last for 13 years. But by 1704, 3 years into the war, things were going catastrophically badly for the Grand Alliance. France was winning almost everywhere. In Spain itself, Philip was secure on his throne with popular support and French military backing. In Italy, French forces were gaining ground. In the Netherlands, the war had bogged down into a grinding stalemate, and most dangerous of all, a French army under Marshal Tallard and a Bavarian army under the Elector Maximilian Emanuel had joined forces in southern Germany and were threatening Vienna itself. Let me explain why Bavaria had sided with France. The Elector of Bavaria, Max Emanuel, was one of the most powerful German princes. He'd fought against the Ottoman Turks and distinguished himself as a military commander. But he had ambitions that Austria and the Empire weren't willing to support. He wanted a crown of his own, perhaps King of the Spanish Netherlands or even King of Lombardy. Louis XIV offered to make those dreams come true if Bavaria would ally with France against the Empire. Max Emanuel took the deal. In 1702, he signed a secret treaty with France. In NATO 1703, he revealed it publicly, and Bavarian forces joined the French. This was a disaster for the Allies. Bavaria's position in southern Germany opened up a route for French armies to march straight toward Austria. It split the empire geographically. It provided Louis with a powerful ally right in the heart of Germany. By 1704, French and Bavarian armies were cooperating, advancing on Vienna. If Vienna fell, the war was over. Austria would have to make peace. The Holy Roman Empire, already weak, would effectively collapse. The smaller German states would have to accommodate France. The Dutch would be isolated. England would be left without continental allies, facing a triumphant France-Spain coalition with no way to resist. The Allied leadership understood all this. They knew Vienna had to be saved. The problem was that the main Allied army, the one capable of confronting the Franco-Bavarian forces, was hundreds of miles away in the Spanish Netherlands, protecting the Dutch Republic. Moving that army south would take months. It would require marching through multiple territories, coordinating with different Allied contingents who didn't always cooperate well, and somehow getting to Vienna before the city was besieged and fell. Most Allied commanders thought it was impossible. But there was one man who thought differently. One commander who looked at the situation and saw not impossibility, but opportunity. His name was John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, and he was about to undertake one of the most audacious campaigns in military history. John Churchill's life story reads like an adventure novel. He'd been born in 1650 to a minor gentry family that had lost much of its wealth in the English Civil War. His father was a royalist who'd followed King Charles II into exile, but received little reward when the monarchy was restored in 1660. Young John Churchill had to make his own way in the world, and he did so through a combination of personal charm, tactical brilliance, and carefully calculated risk-taking. At 12, he became a page boy in the household of the Duke of York, the future King James II. This gave him access to the royal court and connections with powerful people. When he was 17, he received a commission in the King's Regiment of Foot Guards and saw his first combat in Tangier, fighting against Moorish raiders. He distinguished himself immediately, showing a coolness under fire and tactical instincts that marked him as someone special. He fought in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, serving with distinction at the Battle of Solebay and later at the Siege of Maastricht, where he personally saved the life of the Duke of Monmouth during a desperate assault on the walls. His bravery earned him promotions and royal favor. By the time he was 25, he was a colonel, wealthy from royal gifts, and married to Sarah Jennings, a beautiful and intelligent woman who had become his partner in both love and political maneuvering. Marlborough's career had its share of setbacks, too. He'd navigated the treacherous politics of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when James II was overthrown and replaced by William of Orange. Marlborough had initially supported James, but switched sides to William at a crucial moment, helping ensure the revolution succeeded without major bloodshed. Some called him a traitor for this. Others called him a pragmatist who put country above personal loyalty. Either way, he survived when others didn't. Under William III, Marlborough commanded Allied forces in Flanders and Ireland, demonstrating his skill at coalition warfare. He understood that fighting as part of an alliance required not just military skill, but diplomatic finesse. You had to manage egos, negotiate compromises, and keep fractious allies working together. When Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702, Marlborough's position became even stronger. His wife Sarah was Anne's closest friend and most trusted advisor. Anne made Marlborough Captain General of English forces and gave him broad authority to conduct the war as he saw fit. She trusted him completely, and that trust was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. By May of 1704, Marlborough had concluded that Vienna must be saved and that he was the one who had to do it. But he faced enormous obstacles, and not just military ones. The Dutch field deputies, civilian officials who accompanied the Dutch contingent of the Allied army, had effective veto power over major military operations. They were cautious men, merchants and politicians rather than soldiers, and they were terrified of risking the Dutch army in a major battle far from home. The Dutch also had strategic priorities that didn't align with saving Vienna. They wanted the army to stay in the Netherlands, protecting their territory from French attack. Marching south would leave them exposed. The field deputies would never approve such a risk. So Marlborough did something that showed both his genius and his audacity. He decided to deceive his own allies. He would tell the Dutch he was planning a limited campaign on the Moselle River, which wasn't far from the Netherlands and seemed reasonable. They'd approve that. Then, once he was on the march, he'd keep going all the way to the Danube before they realized what he was really doing. This was an enormous gamble. If it failed, if the campaign went badly, or if the Dutch felt too betrayed, Marlborough could be dismissed from command, recalled to England in disgrace, maybe even prosecuted. He was risking his reputation, his career, everything he'd built, but he believed it was necessary. Vienna had to be saved, and cautious committee warfare wouldn't save it. Someone had to act decisively, even if that meant bending the rules. In early May, Marlborough began preparing for the march. He contacted Allied commanders along the route, arranging for supply depots to be established at regular intervals. He coordinated with Imperial and German commanders, securing their cooperation. He sent messages to Prince Eugene of Savoy, the Austrian commander, explaining his plan and requesting that Eugene bring his forces to link up with the main army. And he told the Dutch he was planning to campaign on the Moselle, a limited operation to pressure France from that direction. The Dutch field deputies approved. They thought Marlborough was planning a sensible, limited campaign. They had no idea he intended to march his entire army across Germany. On May 19th, the march began. 40,000 men, including British, Dutch, Danish, and German troops, plus thousands of horses, hundreds of wagons, and all the supplies needed to keep an army functioning, left their camps in the Netherlands and headed south. Marlborough had organized everything with meticulous care. Supply depots waited along the route with bread, meat, beer, and fodder for the horses. Cobblers had been contracted to have new shoes ready because soldiers marching long distances would wear through their footwear. Hospitals were prepared to receive sick and injured men. Nothing was left to chance. The army marched in good order, covering 15 to 20 miles per day, which was excellent time for an 18th century force. Morale remained high because the men were well fed and well supplied. Compare this to most armies of the era, which simply foraged from the countryside, leaving a trail of devastation and arriving at their destination exhausted and starving. Marlborough understood that logistics win wars. An army that's hungry, tired, and diseased can't fight effectively. Take care of your soldiers, and they'll take care of you. As the army moved south, crossing into German territories, Marlborough still maintained the fiction that he was heading for the Moselle. He sent reconnaissance parties in that direction. He talked about his plans for operations on that river. But all the while, he was positioning his forces to keep marching south. By the time the Dutch deputies realized what was happening, the army was so far from the Netherlands that there was no point in turning back. They were furious, but they couldn't stop him. Marlborough had committed them to his plan, whether they liked it or not. On June 10th, after covering more than 250 miles in less than a month, Marlborough's army reached the town of Blenheim on the Danube River. They had accomplished one of the most remarkable strategic movements in military history. An army of 40,000 men had marched across Germany, maintaining discipline and cohesion, arriving in excellent condition and ready to fight. Waiting for Marlborough at the Danube was Prince Eugene of Savoy, and the meeting between these two men would prove to be one of the most significant military partnerships in history. Eugene was 40 years old in 1704, a small, thin man who looked more like a scholar than a soldier. But appearances were deceiving. Eugene was one of the greatest military minds of his generation, aggressive, intuitive, and fearless. Eugene had been born in Paris, oddly enough, to a French mother and an Italian father. He'd wanted to join the French army, but Louis XIV had refused him a commission, apparently thinking he was too small and weak to be a soldier. Insulted and angry, Eugene had left France and offered his services to Austria. The Austrians gave him command, and he'd spent the last 20 years proving Louis wrong. He'd fought the Ottoman Turks in Hungary, winning stunning victories at Zenta and elsewhere. He'd campaigned in Italy against the French. He was known for his daring attacks, his willingness to take risks, and his ability to inspire soldiers to follow him into impossible situations. When Marlborough and Eugene met, they took an immediate liking to each other. Despite their different backgrounds and personalities, they shared a common vision of how to fight the war. They both believed in aggressive action. They both understood the importance of seizing the initiative. They both were willing to take calculated risks, and they both had utter contempt for the cautious defensive warfare that too many Allied commanders favored. They also complemented each other perfectly. Marlborough was diplomatic, patient, skilled at managing the complex politics of coalition warfare. Eugene was aggressive, impatient, willing to push hard and damn the consequences. Marlborough thought strategically, seeing the big picture. Eugene thought tactically, focused on the immediate fight. Together, they made an unbeatable combination. But even united, they faced a serious problem. The Franco-Bavarian army was formidable. Marshal Camille de Tallard had arrived from Alsace with French reinforcements, bringing the total enemy strength to about 56,000 men. The Elector of Bavaria commanded the Bavarian contingent. Marshal Marsin commanded another French corps. These were experienced commanders with veteran troops, and they were operating in friendly territory with good supply lines and strong fortifications. Marlborough and Eugene had about 52,000 men between them, slightly outnumbered. Worse, they were operating at the end of a very long supply line. They were in enemy territory. They had limited siege equipment and would struggle to reduce the strong fortresses in Bavaria, and time was against them. If they couldn't force a decisive battle soon, their campaign might fail simply from lack of supplies and the approach of winter. The French and Bavarian commanders understood all this. Their strategy was simple. Avoid battle, stay behind fortifications, and wait for Marlborough to exhaust himself trying to force a fight. Time and logistics would do the work for them. They didn't need to defeat Marlborough in open battle. They just needed to survive until he had to retreat. For several weeks in June and July, Marlborough and Eugene maneuvered, trying to bring the enemy to battle. They marched toward Bavarian strongholds, threatening to besiege them. The enemy would withdraw behind fortifications. They'd try to cut enemy supply lines. The enemy would reposition. It was a frustrating game of cat and mouse, and Marlborough knew he couldn't win it. Then, in late July, Marlborough did something unexpected. He launched a surprise assault on the town of Rain on the Danube. Rain wasn't strategically crucial, but capturing it threatened enemy supply lines. Then he made a show of preparing to besiege Ingolstadt, another Bavarian fortress. He moved artillery into position. He began digging siege works. He made it look like he was committing to a long siege. This finally provoked the reaction he wanted. Marshal Tallard, who'd been waiting in Alsace, received orders to march to Bavaria with reinforcements and relieve Ingolstadt. More importantly, the combined Franco-Bavarian army decided they needed to confront Marlborough before he could take Ingolstadt. But here's the brilliant part. Marlborough never intended to actually take Ingolstadt. The siege preparations were a feint, a deception to draw the enemy out. Once he got word that Tallard was marching with reinforcements and the Franco-Bavarian army was preparing to seek battle, Marlborough abandoned the siege and maneuvered to meet them. The French commanders, realizing they'd been tricked into leaving their fortifications, tried to recover. Tallard's reinforcements arrived, boosting their numbers. They looked for a good defensive position where they could make Marlborough attack them on unfavorable terms. They found it near a small village called Blenheim, which English speakers would call Blenheim. On August 12th, French scouts confirmed that Tallard's entire army had taken up a strong defensive position along the Danube, anchored on the river at one end and hills at the other, with 3 fortified villages spacing their line and a marshy stream called the Nebel protecting their center. It was an excellent position. Tallard was confident. He had more men, better ground, and strong defenses. Let the Allies attack if they dared. They'd be smashed against French lines and destroyed. That evening, Marlborough and Eugene rode forward with a small escort to personally scout the enemy position. This was risky. If French cavalry spotted them, they could be captured or killed. But Marlborough insisted on seeing the ground himself. He needed to understand the terrain, the enemy deployment, every detail that would matter in battle. What he saw would have discouraged most commanders. The French and Bavarian armies stretched nearly 4 miles, far too long to flank. The Nebel stream in front of their center position was bordered by marshes that would slow any attacking force. The 3 villages, Blenheim, Oberglau, and Lutzingen, were heavily fortified and garrisoned with elite troops. French cavalry filled the gaps between the villages. Artillery was positioned to sweep the Antwerp approaches. It was a formidable defensive array, but Marlborough's trained eye saw something others might have missed. The French had made several subtle mistakes in their deployment. First, they'd packed too many troops into Blenheim village itself. Marlborough could see the banners of multiple battalions crowded into a small space. That was inefficient. Those troops couldn't maneuver or support each other properly. Second, the French line was stretched too thin in the center. To cover 4 miles of front, Tallard had to spread his forces across a wide area. His center, between Blenheim and Oberglau, looked undermanned. Third, the Nebel stream, while a good defensive obstacle, also limited the French ability to counterattack. If the Allies got across the stream and established a strong position on the far side, the French would have difficulty driving them back. Marlborough saw all this in the fading light of evening on August 12th, and he made his decision. He would attack at dawn. Marlborough's plan was audacious and complex. He would pin the French forces in Blenheim and Lutzingen with diversionary attacks, preventing them from reinforcing the center. Then he would force a crossing of the Nebel with his main strength and smash through the French center, splitting their army in 2 and destroying it in detail. It was an extraordinarily risky plan. Crossing a river in the face of the enemy is one of the most difficult military operations. Doing so while under artillery and cavalry attack could lead to disaster. Most 18th century commanders would never attempt such a crossing against a prepared enemy. But Marlborough had several advantages. First, he had excellent troops, well-trained and disciplined men who would maintain their cohesion even under fire. Second, he had numerical near parity with the enemy, which meant he could absorb casualties and still maintain the attack. Third, he had Eugene, who would command the right wing and could be trusted to execute his part of the plan with determination and skill. Fourth, he had the element of surprise. The French expected him to avoid battle, not launch an all-out assault on a strong defensive position. And fifth, most importantly, Marlborough had absolute confidence in his own judgment. That night, Marlborough called his senior officers together and explained the plan. Eugene would take about 18,000 men and attack Lutzingen and the Bavarian left flank. His objective wasn't necessarily to capture Lutzingen, but to pin the Bavarian and French forces there so they couldn't reinforce the center. Lord Cutts, commanding a smaller force on the Allied left, would attack Blenheim village with about 11 battalions. Again, his objective wasn't to capture the village, though if he could, that would be a bonus. His real job was to pin down the massive French garrison there and prevent them from joining the fight elsewhere. The main effort would come in the center, where Marlborough would personally lead the bulk of the Allied cavalry and infantry across the Nebel, engage the French center, and break through. This was where the battle would be won or lost. The plan required almost perfect coordination across 4 miles of battlefield, with no way to communicate in real time except by sending galloping messengers. If any part failed, if Eugene was defeated, or if Cutts couldn't hold the French in Blenheim, or if Marlborough's crossing was repulsed, the entire army could be destroyed. At 2 in the morning on August 13th, the Allied army began to move. In darkness, with only starlight and the occasional torch to guide them, 52,000 men marched toward the French position. It was slow, careful work. Units had to stay together, maintain their order, move quietly. The French had sentries out, and if they gave too much warning, the element of surprise would be lost. But fog had rolled in from the Danube, thick and clammy, reducing visibility to a few yards. The Allied army moved through this fog like ghosts, getting closer and closer to the French lines without being detected. At 6 o'clock, as the first light of dawn began to penetrate the fog, French sentries finally spotted the Allied army. They were there, deployed for battle, less than a mile away, battle lines formed, banners flying, tens of thousands of men ready to fight. Alarm guns fired. French drums beat the assembly. Soldiers ran to their positions. Officers shouted orders. The French and Bavarian army scrambled to prepare for an attack they hadn't expected. Marshal Tallard, sleeping in a house in Blenheim village, was roused by his aides. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Allies were attacking in force against his position. It seemed insane. He rushed out to see for himself, and yes, there they were. The entire Allied army, deployed and advancing. For a moment, Tallard felt a mix of emotions. Surprise, certainly, but also confidence. Let them come. They'd break themselves against French defenses. This battle would be the decisive victory Louis XIV wanted. He was about to learn that he had severely underestimated his opponent. At 8 o'clock, as the fog began to lift and the morning sun broke through, Allied artillery opened fire. 60 guns positioned along the front began hammering the French lines with solid shot and explosive shells. The French artillery responded immediately. The ground shook with the concussion of cannon fire. On the Allied left wing, Lord Cutts launched his attack toward Blenheim village. Cutts was a legend in the British Army, a man who seemed to have no fear. He'd been wounded multiple times in previous battles and had earned his nickname Salamander because he moved through fire unscathed. His soldiers loved him and would follow him anywhere. Now he was asking them to assault a fortified village packed with French elite infantry. The approach to Blenheim was across open ground, offering little cover. French infantry lined the walls and barricades, muskets ready. Kutz's British and Hessian battalions advanced in perfect order, a demonstration of disciplined courage that was both inspiring and terrible to watch. At 200 yards, the French opened fire. The first volley was devastating, cutting down dozens of men. But the Allied soldiers closed ranks and kept advancing. At 100 yards, another volley. More men fell. Still they came. At 50 yards, the French unleashed everything they had, musketry coming so fast it sounded like one continuous explosion. The first British regiment to reach the village was virtually destroyed. They charged forward, bayonets fixed, trying to get over the barricades and into the village where they could use cold steel, but the French position was too strong. The attack broke, survivors falling back to reorganize. Kutz rallied his men and ordered another assault. Again, British and Hessian infantry advanced into the killing ground. Again, they were repulsed with terrible losses. The ground in front of Blenheim was covered with dead and wounded men, but Kutz kept attacking. He knew his job: pin the French garrison in Blenheim, keep them so busy defending they can't leave the village. He was succeeding, but at a horrific cost. Inside Blenheim, the French commander, the Marquis de Clermont-Beau, was making a crucial mistake. He saw the ferocity of the British attacks and concluded he was facing the main Allied assault. Panicking, Clermont-Beau called for reinforcements. More French battalions marched into Blenheim, adding to the already overcrowded garrison. This was exactly what Marlborough had hoped for. Every French soldier packed into Blenheim was a soldier who wouldn't be in the center. Clermont-Beau had 27 battalions in Blenheim, over 10,000 men squeezed into a village that couldn't effectively deploy more than a fraction of that number. On the Allied right wing, Prince Eugene launched his attack toward Lutzingen. This was difficult terrain, broken and hilly, not ideal for military formations. Eugene's troops had to advance uphill against prepared positions. Bavarian and French soldiers waited behind earthworks and in the village itself. As Eugene's men came into musket range, they were met with devastating volleys of fire. The first ranks went down in heaps, but the men behind stepped over their fallen comrades and kept coming. They returned fire, loading and firing as quickly as they could. The noise was deafening, a constant crackle of musketry mixed with the screams of wounded men and the shouts of officers trying to maintain control. Eugene's attack stalled. The Bavarians and French held their ground. Eugene reorganized his troops and attacked again and again. Each assault was repulsed with heavy casualties. But Eugene understood his mission. He didn't need to capture Lutzingen. He needed to pin the enemy there, and he was succeeding. Every Bavarian soldier focused on defending Lutzingen was a soldier who couldn't reinforce the French center. While Eugene fought on the right and Kutz attacked on the left, Marlborough prepared for the main effort in the center. He had to get his troops across the Nebel stream and establish a strong position on the far side. The Nebel was a formidable obstacle. It wasn't a simple stream, it was bordered on both sides by marshy ground. While the water itself wasn't deep, the approach and exit were difficult. Troops would have to struggle through mud, wade through water, climb up the far bank, all while under fire from French cavalry and artillery. Marlborough had prepared for this. He'd sent pioneers forward overnight to identify the best crossing points and, where possible, to construct makeshift bridges using fascines, bundles of sticks and branches. He'd also positioned his artillery to provide covering fire. At around noon, with Eugene and Kutz fully engaged on the flanks, Marlborough gave the order. The first wave of Allied cavalry and infantry began moving toward the Nebel. They advanced at a steady pace, maintaining formation. French artillery opened fire as soon as the Allied troops came into range. Cannonballs smashed into the advancing formations. Gaps appeared where men had been standing moments before, but the advance continued. The first squadrons of Allied cavalry reached the Nebel and began crossing. Horses plunged into the water, struggling through the mud on both banks. Some animals lost their footing and went down, throwing their riders, but most made it across. On the far side, cavalrymen reformed their squadrons as quickly as they could, trying to establish a foothold before the French counterattacked. But the French weren't waiting passively. Marshal Tallard had finally realized that this was the main Allied attack. He ordered his cavalry forward, squadrons of French horsemen among the finest in Europe, charging toward the Nebel to catch the Allied troops while they were disordered and vulnerable. The first clash came as Allied cavalry was still forming up after their crossing. French squadrons smashed into them with devastating effect. Some Allied units, not yet fully formed, gave ground. Some broke and retreated back across the Nebel. French cavalry pursued, cutting down fleeing soldiers. For a moment, it looked like the crossing might fail, but Marlborough had anticipated this. He'd held back substantial reserves, and now he committed them. Fresh Allied cavalry squadrons charged across the Nebel and hit the French cavalry in the flank while they were pursuing the first wave. The fighting became a massive, swirling melee with thousands of horsemen locked in combat, and Marlborough himself was in the thick of it. He personally led several charges, rallying his troops by example. On multiple occasions, he came within feet of French cavalrymen who would have killed or captured him if they had recognized who he was. For several hours, the struggle raged in the center. Allied and French, cavalry charged and countercharged. Neither side could gain a permanent advantage. Men and horses fell by the hundreds, but gradually, inexorably, the balance shifted. More Allied troops got across the Nebel. Marlborough's superior organization and logistics showed. His troops maintained their cohesion better. They rallied faster after being repulsed. They coordinated their attacks more effectively. The French cavalry, fighting magnificently but without the same level of support and organization, began to tire. And the French had another problem. Because Tallard had allowed so many troops to be drawn into Blenheim village, his center was undermanned. As Allied infantry began crossing the Nebel and forming up on the far side, they created a solid base of support for the Allied cavalry. The French cavalry, without equivalent infantry support, were increasingly vulnerable. By mid-afternoon, Marlborough had built up overwhelming strength in the center. He had more cavalry across the Nebel than the French could match. He had infantry providing fire support. He had artillery positioned to hammer the French positions. The time had come for the decisive blow. Marlborough organized his forces for one massive, coordinated attack. Every unit in the center would advance simultaneously. Cavalry would charge on both flanks. Infantry would advance in the middle, delivering volleys of musket fire. Artillery would provide support. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Marlborough gave the order to advance. Across the Allied center, trumpets sounded, drums beat, and the entire force surged forward. Thousands of cavalrymen charged in perfect order. Infantry marched forward with leveled muskets, ready to fire. It must have been a terrifying sight for the French defenders, this massive wall of enemy soldiers advancing with unstoppable momentum. The French center tried to hold. French cavalry charged to meet the assault. Some French infantry battalions hastily moved up to support the cavalry, formed lines and fired volleys. But they were outnumbered and outflanked. The Allied attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. The French center began to disintegrate. French cavalry units, after hours of fighting, were exhausted and could no longer maintain their cohesion. They broke and fled. French infantry battalions, seeing cavalry riding through them in retreat, lost their nerve and joined the rout. Within minutes, what had been an organized defensive position became a panicked mass of fleeing soldiers. Marshal Tallard, watching his center collapse, tried desperately to rally his troops. He rode among the fleeing soldiers, shouting orders, trying to restore some semblance of order. But it was hopeless. The rout had become a stampede. In the chaos, Tallard became separated from his staff. He was riding through what he thought was French-controlled territory when he suddenly found himself surrounded by Allied cavalry. They demanded his surrender. Tallard, Realizing the battle was lost and that he was captured, handed over his sword to a British lieutenant colonel. The commander of the Franco-Bavarian army had been taken prisoner. The capture of Tallard sealed the fate of the French army. With their center broken and their commander captured, the French right wing collapsed completely. Thousands of French soldiers found themselves trapped between the advancing Allies and the Danube River. The river here was deep and fast-flowing, almost impossible to swim across, especially for men in full uniform and equipment. Desperate French soldiers tried anyway. They plunged into the water, hoping to reach the far bank. Most drowned, pulled under by the current or the weight of their equipment. Those who didn't try to swim were cut down by Allied cavalry or surrendered. On the flanks, the remaining French and Bavarian forces saw what had happened and began to retreat. Eugene's exhausted troops pursued the Bavarians, but they didn't have the strength for a vigorous chase. That left only the French garrison in Blenheim village. Over 10,000 elite French infantry, among the best soldiers in Europe, still held the village. They were undefeated, still in good order, their morale intact. But they were completely surrounded, cut off, with no hope of relief. As evening fell, Marlborough sent envoys to demand their surrender. The French officers in Blenheim initially refused. They were prepared to fight their way out or die trying. But as they assessed their situation, the reality became clear. They were surrounded by the entire victorious Allied army. They had no artillery support, no cavalry, no supply. They couldn't break out, and a last stand would accomplish nothing except getting thousands of men killed for no purpose. At 9 o'clock in the evening, as darkness settled over the battlefield, the garrison of Blenheim surrendered. 27 battalions of French infantry, over 10,000 men, laid down their arms and marched out of the village as prisoners of war. It was one of the largest surrenders of troops in European warfare up to that time. The Battle of Blenheim was over. In one day of fighting, from dawn to dusk, Marlborough and Eugene had achieved one of the most complete victories in military history. The Franco-Bavarian army had been destroyed. French casualties were staggering, perhaps 12,000 killed or wounded, 15,000 captured, including the entire garrison of Blenheim and Marshal Tallard himself. The French had lost all their artillery, over 100 guns. They'd lost their baggage, supplies, ammunition, everything. 128 French regimental colors and battle standards had been captured, physical symbols of French defeat. Allied losses were also heavy, about 12,000 casualties in total, with Eugene's wings suffering disproportionately. These were terrible numbers, representing thousands of families that would receive news that husbands, fathers, sons would never return. But they had won a victory that would change the course of the war and European history. The immediate strategic consequences were profound. The threat to Vienna evaporated overnight. French armies began retreating back across the Rhine. The Elector of Bavaria fled into exile, his electorate occupied by Allied forces. The entire Franco-Bavarian position in southern Germany collapsed. Not only had Vienna been saved, but the initiative in the war had completely shifted to the Allies. When news of the victory reached England, the country exploded in celebration. This was the greatest military triumph England had achieved in generations. Church bells rang across the nation. Bonfires were lit in every town and village. In London, crowds filled the streets, celebrating until dawn. Queen Anne, overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, declared that Marlborough would be rewarded beyond any previous general in British history. She granted him the royal manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire and promised to build him a palace there at public expense. That palace, designed by John Vanbrugh, would take decades to complete and would be named Blenheim Palace, a permanent monument to the battle. It remains one of the grandest stately homes in England, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the birthplace of Winston Churchill, Marlborough's famous descendant. The impact of Blenheim echoed across Europe. In Paris, the news was received with shock and disbelief. Louis XIV's court, accustomed to French military dominance, couldn't comprehend how their army had been so thoroughly defeated. The myth of French invincibility was shattered. Louis would continue the war for another 9 years, but he would never again come close to the overwhelming dominance he'd enjoyed before Blenheim. What made Blenheim truly revolutionary wasn't just the tactical victory, it was how Marlborough had won it. Every element of his campaign demonstrated principles that would become fundamental to modern warfare. First, there was strategic deception. Marlborough had fooled not just his enemies but his own allies about his true intentions. The march to the Danube succeeded because nobody expected it. The French were caught completely off guard. Second, there was logistics mastery. Moving 40,000 men across Germany while keeping them fed, equipped, and ready to fight was a masterpiece of military administration. Marlborough understood that armies march on their stomachs, and he never let his men go hungry. Third, there was coalition management. Marlborough had to coordinate British, Dutch, Danish, German, and Austrian forces, armies with different languages, different traditions, different political objectives. Keeping them working together required diplomatic skills as important as military ones. Fourth, there was tactical innovation. The coordinated assault across the Nebel, with simultaneous attacks on both flanks to pin enemy forces, was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery worked together with precision timing. Fifth, there was leadership by example. Marlborough personally led cavalry charges, exposed himself to enemy fire, and shared the dangers with his men. That bred a level of trust and loyalty that few commanders achieve. But we should never forget the human cost of Blenheim. 24,000 casualties in a single day, in an era when entire armies were sometimes smaller than that. Each of those casualties represented a person, someone with a family, friends, dreams. The wounded faced primitive medical care that often did more harm than good. Many would die of infections in the days and weeks following the battle. Survivors might be crippled for life. Families would be devastated by news of fathers and sons who would never return. Consider Private Thomas Atkins of the 1st Foot Guards, who was hit by a French musket ball during the assault across the Nebel. The bullet shattered his left arm below the elbow. Field surgeons working in a hastily established casualty station decided the arm couldn't be saved. Atkins was held down by orderlies while a surgeon amputated, using brandy for anesthesia, but the dose was insufficient to fully block the pain. Atkins screamed. Many wounded men screamed. The sounds from the casualty stations haunted everyone who heard them. On the French side, the wounded faced even worse conditions. British medical services, while primitive, at least attempted to care for all casualties. But many French wounded were never reached by medical help. They lay on the battlefield or crawled away to die alone. War in the early 18th century produced suffering on a scale that's hard to fully appreciate in our era of modern battlefield medicine. So why has Blenheim faded from popular memory? Why isn't Marlborough celebrated like Nelson or Wellington? Why doesn't this battle occupy the same place in British consciousness that Trafalgar or Waterloo does? Several factors contributed to its relative obscurity. First, the War of the Spanish Succession itself is complex and hard to explain to modern audiences. Multiple nations, shifting alliances, dynastic politics, it doesn't have the clear narrative that makes other conflicts easy to understand. Second, Blenheim wasn't the final decisive battle of the war. Fighting continued for another 9 years after Blenheim, with multiple other battles and campaigns. While Blenheim was strategically decisive in saving Vienna and turning the war in the Allies' favor, it didn't immediately end the conflict. Third, the battle took place in what's now Germany, far from British soil. It wasn't defending Britain directly, wasn't protecting British territory. For modern British audiences, battles fought on British soil or defending Britain itself naturally resonate more. Fourth, Marlborough's subsequent victories, Ramillies in 1706, Oudenarde in 1708, and Malplaquet in 1709, somewhat overshadowed Blenheim. Marlborough never lost a battle in his entire career. He won so consistently that his victories almost seemed routine. Fifth, Marlborough's later years were marked by political controversy. He fell out of favor with Queen Anne in 1711, partly due to political machinations by his rivals, partly due to Anne's changing political views. He was dismissed from command and actually fled to the continent for a time, living in self-imposed exile. Finally, as wars became larger and more destructive in the 19th and 20th centuries, Blenheim's scale seemed less impressive to modern audiences, familiar with world wars where single battles could produce 1 million casualties. Despite these factors that led to its eclipse in popular memory, military historians have never forgotten Blenheim. It remains a case study in how to conduct military operations at the highest level. The strategic march, the tactical coordination, the personal leadership, the diplomatic management of allies. All of it came together perfectly in a way that's rarely been matched. Winston Churchill, writing his 4-volume biography of Marlborough in the 1930s, devoted enormous attention to Blenheim. Churchill clearly saw parallels between his ancestors' fight against French hegemony and his own coming fight against Nazi Germany. Both required Britain to commit fully to continental warfare. Both required coalition building and management. Both required leaders willing to take strategic risks. David Chandler, one of the foremost military historians of the 18th century, called Marlborough's 1704 campaign probably the most brilliant in British military history. The integrated nature of the campaign, how Marlborough combined deception, logistics, diplomacy, and tactics into one seamless operation, remains a model for military professionals. The principles demonstrated at Blenheim remain relevant today. Speed and surprise still matter. Coalition management is still crucial. Logistics still determine what's possible strategically. Leadership by example still inspires troops to extraordinary efforts. Modern military officers study Blenheim not to learn specific tactics. The technology has changed completely, but to understand timeless principles of warfare and leadership. How do you achieve surprise? How do you coordinate complex operations? How do you maintain momentum? How do you manage allies with competing interests? These questions don't have easy answers, but studying historical examples like Blenheim helps develop the critical thinking skills that officers need. The consequences of Blenheim rippled through the next century and beyond. British power grew steadily after 1704. The Royal Navy became dominant, protecting trade and enabling imperial expansion. Britain's commercial economy flourished. The country that had been relatively small and peripheral in European affairs became a great power. None of that was inevitable. If Vienna had fallen in 1704, if the French had won, Britain's trajectory would have been completely different. The British Empire, as we know it, might never have existed. The Industrial Revolution might have occurred elsewhere. The English-speaking world's influence might have been minimal. These are huge what-ifs, but they illustrate how much hung on that August day in 1704. Individual actions, even individual battles, can have consequences far beyond what anyone imagines at the time. Today, if you visit the battlefield at Blenheim, you'll find peaceful Bavarian farmland. The village is still there, now called Blenheim in modern Germany. There are monuments and markers, but you have to look for them. Most people driving past have no idea that this quiet place was once drenched in blood, that men marched here knowing they would die, that history pivoted on what happened in these fields. Standing on that ground, you can still sense the magnitude of what occurred. The gentle rise where Eugene's men fought and died. The line of the old Nebel stream where Marlborough's cavalry charged through water and mud. The site of Blenheim village where thousands of French soldiers surrendered in the gathering darkness. It's all still there, hidden beneath the surface of modern life, waiting for anyone willing to look closely enough to find it. The story of Blenheim reminds us that history is made by countless individual decisions, by people doing their best in circumstances they barely understand, by courage and fear and luck and timing, all colliding in ways no one can predict. Marlborough's decision to march to the Danube, Eugene's determination to hold the Bavarian army at Lutzingen, Kutz's refusal to give up his attacks on Blenheim village, the anonymous soldiers who crossed the Nebel under fire and kept advancing even as their comrades fell around them. All of these choices mattered. All of them contributed to an outcome that changed the course of European history. The men who made those choices, most of whose names we'll never know, deserved better than to be forgotten. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Blenheim. Not just the tactical innovations or the strategic consequences, but the reminder that history is made by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. That courage and competence and moral clarity can overcome apparently impossible odds. That sometimes, when everything depends on it, individuals can rise to meet the moment and change the world. The redcoats who marched across Germany in the summer of 1704 didn't know they were making history. They were just doing their duty, following their orders, trusting their commander. But in doing so, they saved Vienna, turned a war, preserved the balance of power in Europe, and made possible the world we live in today. They achieved perfection in the art of war, even if the world has largely forgotten their names, and perhaps, in the end, that's enough. They did what needed to be done, when it needed to be done, as well as it could possibly be done. That's what makes a battle perfect, even if no one remembers it.